Hey guys, it's Tim here. I wanted to make a video that kind of elaborated a little bit more on the video that I just put on Twitter. If you didn't see it, it was basically using 3D models to use as reference or guides for doing frame by frame animated stuff, specifically cloaks in this particular instance, but it could be, whatever. For starters, you're going to want to go to MIXAMO or really any other motion capture library. There's a lot actually. You'd be surprised. Some include, I've got a list here. There's a website called Deep Motion where you can load in videos of any human doing stuff. And I haven't used it like a tremendous amount, but it seems pretty reliable so far. You pop the video in, it uses some AI shit to like create an FBX for you of a character moving around. Additionally, you can maybe use a Connect. You could possibly do game dev websites and just kind of steal those FBX files if you want. I wouldn't recommend you use copyright shit for any professional work unless you have a license for it. But for this kind of stuff, when you're just doing some practice, keeping it to yourself, I wouldn't worry too much about it. We'll see if this comes back to bite me. Anyways, you can go look around for some motion capture libraries. They're relatively abundant. MIXAMO is probably the best example right now. They will give you a like a library of different stuff. It's pretty thorough, I'd say, for just about anything you want. But what you'll do is once you've downloaded your FBX file, you'll go into Blender. You'll go to File, Import FBX, and I have here a couple of animations. We're going to go specifically with this jumping to FBX. And we'll get this little fella. I'll hide this cube. Oh, also, let me enable the shortcut viewer so you can see what keys I'm pressing. That's probably going to be helpful. Before I get too deep into this, I want to talk about a couple of basics for using Blender, hence the screencast keys. This isn't going to be a very thorough or in-depth Blender tutorial or anything like that, but I want to make sure that you guys are able to follow along however much you'd like to. And I don't want you to bounce off of Blender because it looks complicated or confusing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basic shortcuts, and especially the things that I think will be relevant for this type of thing. If you don't have any interest in Blender or anything in 3D modeling, but you would like to use, stuff like this for reference, I want to make sure that you can at least do that. So, basically, we're going to want to add in a cube for this character to jump on. So I'm going to press Shift-A and add a cube in. Following that, we can press the G key to move this up and down. And if you want to move it exactly up and down, you can press the Z key to move it only up and down, the X key to move it only on the X axis, and the Y for just the Y axis. At any point, if you want to cancel an action, you can right-click to undo that. Bear in mind, it's not exactly like an undo. It's more of a put it back where it was. And that's relevant because if you want to extrude something, if you press E to extrude it and then right-click, it doesn't undo the extrusion. So you'll end up with like bad topology basically, and you don't really want that. However, if you press Control Z, it'll undo that. I think it's worth noting. But I guess for basic like viewport navigation, if you hold the middle click, you can orbit around. If you hold Shift and middle click, you can pan. And of course, scrolling zooms in and out. If you press the Tab key at any point when you have an object selected, it'll switch into not necessarily edit mode, but rather it'll go between the two most commonly used or most recently used modes. So if I were to go into Vertex Paint, press Tab, it would go to edit mode, and Tab would go back to Vertex Paint. So it's not exactly going back and forth between object and edit mode, but for the most part, it'll probably do that. However, if you're looking to get in edit mode or object mode and you're not, top left window, you can change that. So, for all intents and purposes, you can expect tab to work for object in edit mode. We've already got Shift A for adding in primitives. I think we do. Let's just make sure. Shift A, you can add a primitive in. All sorts of stuff. Some of my things will look a bit different because I'm using some add-ons, but it's not really relevant to this. Shift A will almost certainly work. If it doesn't, consult the help manual, because there's something seriously wrong if it doesn't. Anyways, if we go back into edit mode by pressing tab, we can make a little shelf here for this character to jump off of. So I'm going to hold Control and press R to create a loop cut, bearing in mind the loop cuts only work on a 4-sided object. If there's more than 4 sides, it might not work. We'll go ahead and choose one of our axes. We want to do the horizontal, so we'll go ahead and left click, and then we can adjust this afterwards. Go ahead and put that right there. Next, I'm going to choose the vertex select, which is in the top left here. It's a little tricky to remember where that's at if you're not familiar with it, but you can choose vertex selections, which allows you to select a single point. Edge selections, which lets you grab an edge. An edge, practically speaking, is basically 2 uninterrupted vertices that are connected. And then thirdly, you have the face. I'll go ahead and select these 2 faces. Actually, no. First, what we'll do is we'll add another loop cut going vertically. And we'll bring it back towards the edge here. That way we have a little bit of surface area to work with right there. I'll go ahead and grab, I guess I'll just grab all these faces here. And I'm holding Shift to select multiples. What we can do now is press the X key and then choose Delete Faces. And that'll leave us with this like shell. And if you're just looking for rough like geometry to have as an object in an environment, this is probably enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. But if you want to go ahead and fill it in, you can do that too. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these 2 vertices and these 2 to grab all 4. Then I'll press F to make a face. And now that that's filled in, I can hold Alt and left click just outside of this vertex here, and it will choose all of the what are called loops, edge loops. And then we can fill those in as well. So now we have a nice little platform for our character. Just to make sure that I have everything I need to work with here, I'll go ahead and bring this out. This character might put her hand down, and if she does that, I want to make sure that I have a bit of geometry that I can extrude. Next up, we're going to go and move this straight down. I want to have this top part of the platform align with the bottom of this character's feet. So if you have an object select and press G, you can freely move it. And if you specifically press Z, I think I talked about this a bit already, you can move it on an axis, specifically right now the Z axis. So we can move that there, we'll bring it back a little bit, and we can play. And we'll see if the character jumps down. I'm going to go ahead and take this object, hold Shift, and then press D to duplicate this, and we'll just put it right in the landing area. Now the character will jump between those 2 platforms. Pretty handy. Lastly, to get more fine-tuned control over this character, as far as like where it's positioned at, because we could just move it like this, and I think in most cases it'll work, but I think I'd rather have more control without having to worry about keyframes over this armature. So I'm going to add an empty. If I press Shift A, I can go down to empties, and we'll grab a plain axis. I'll go ahead and click on the object that I want to become a child, and then I'll shift-click the empty that we have, which is going to become the parent. Hold Control, press P, and object keep transform. And now we can move the empty around, and this character will follow. It's not totally critical for this, but I think it's good for keeping things clean and organized. Okay. What we're going to do next, this is entirely optional, but I think it's something that I like. We're going to set up a quick material for this model. As you can see right now, by default, it's got a pretty like boring and generic texture. But, and again, I repeat, this is totally optional. I did this because I like the aesthetic of it, but it's to make it look more like production materials for an anime. So I'm going to quickly show you guys how to set that up. Again, not really important. You can skip over this if you're not interested in this kind of thing, but it's going to be a very basic toon shader. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this normal map. I don't know why this normal map is here. Oh, I guess I should probably discuss how I pulled this up. It's all kind of second nature to me now, so I tend to rush it. if you click on the top left of any window, you can change the editor type that it is. So down here, this is by default, I believe, the timeline. If you click this and choose shader editor, you can open up the shader editor window, and then you can grab anywhere between two panels and scale them up. The same rules generally apply throughout different editor types. So here, if you scroll in and out, it zooms. Middle click does pans. You can click and drag stuff, as you might expect. But more specifically, what we want to do is press Shift A to add in a new node. And this one specifically is going to be a shader to RGB node. I believe this works with default Blender, but you might need to install Node Wrangler for this to work. But if you take a node and put it on a line between two other nodes, it'll automatically snap the connectors into the correct slots. If you want to install Node Wrangler, you can go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons. You'll go to the search window, type in Node. You'll find Node Wrangler. You can enable it. It's included by default, but turned off by default. Turn that on, it'll work right away. Probably not necessary. Anyways, following the shader to RGB, we're going to add in a color ramp node. Go ahead and plug that in right here. And you can see already it's changed the colors of this model. And these colors are going to be influenced by the light source that's affecting this principled BSDF. If we change some settings on here, like taking the roughness down, for example, depending on where the camera is looking in the rendered view, we should get different results. I'm going to go ahead and change this from linear to constant to get a better view of what we're going to be doing. And this is actually what gives us the toon shader look. Maybe I'll change the specular a little bit as well. If we want to really get some good results out of this, though, we can change the light source. I'll add an area light in here. We'll just put it like this. Here you can see it's much more obvious what the color ramp is doing. Basically, the lighter spots are going to become white, and the darker spots become black. And that's dependent on this color ramp. I have a color palette opened in Clip Studio right now that I use for my animation. I'm gonna go ahead and grab this dark blue here, and this is gonna be the color that we use for the edge of shadows. Slap this in here. This whole material should come set up with the project that I include. I'll include the original project file that I use for the first animation, and that'll be attached to the Patreon post that this is part of. And this will have the material all set up for you, so you won't have to do any of that. Following that, we're going to grab this one. I'm just copying the hex values and pasting them in where they belong. Put that there. Push those right up next to each other. We'll add another one in here, and we'll make this one white. And then I'll add in a red, specifically the red from here. Again, this is totally optional. It's not really that relevant to anything, but I like it and thought you might too. And finally, we added in yellow. This yellow is a little bit more like whatever. I don't really have any good sources for it, so just put that in there. Push this over a bit. This blue here is meant to be like a thin, hard outline, so I want to make sure that these are pretty close to each other. Just like that. And the same for the red and yellow. There we go. It looks pretty good. We'll click on the second part of the skeleton. Usually you'll have two pieces. You'll have the joints and you'll have the main body parts. Aside from just changing the material, there's nothing else you really have to worry about for that. And that's looking pretty good. One more thing we want to do, though, is we want to add a new material. We'll call this one outline. You don't have to really call it anything, but I like to keep track of it. We'll drag this down, make it totally black, and we need to do the same for the other part of the body. This is going to be relevant if you want to keep with the outlined style that I have for mine. At any point, if you want to hide some of the viewport overlays, there's a button up here called Show Overlays that you can toggle off. That makes things a little bit cleaner to look at. Of course, you don't know what you're selecting if you do that, so it might be good to be kind of selective when you use it. Anyways, we're going to take the main body, we're going to add a modifier in, and we'll make it a solidify modifier. What we'll do now is we'll go to normals, click on flip, go to materials, material offset by 1. And one thing that we're missing that's really important for this step is to click on your original material that you're using for the base and enable backface calling. And now what we can do is go back into the modifier tab, and we should be able to change this. Of course, it's going to be the time that I'm making a video that I don't have a solution to one of these problems. I'm not sure why that's happening. Is it the outline that has to be set to backface calling? Yes. Okay. So it's not the base material, it's the outline that you want to use. You'll enable backface calling in the settings down below. That's very relevant. So now what you can do is we'll just add the solidify modifier back on so we can start from scratch with it. So again, flip normals, materials, offset 1, thickness. If you make it go to the left, it'll make the line bigger. However, I believe if you make it a positive number and change the offset back to a positive, it'll have the same effect. But by default, I believe it's set to -1, so we'll make it a negative number. And then I'll just go along the outside. You can enable even thickness if you like. You can enable fill if you like. Doesn't really matter. You can leave it off by default. We'll do the same thing for the other part of the body. Go to solidify. Go to normals, flip. Materials offset by 1. Thickness, up to you. -800 seems pretty good. Now you have a screen space based outline. Pretty nice. All right, one more thing we want to do before we get into the output stage of this. We're going to want to change some of the shadows. Again, this is another optional thing, but if you want your shadows to look good, make sure you increase your cube size, something like 4096, and disable soft shadows. And here you can get more of a sharper edge. And also, if we click on the light source that we have, and in shadows, we turn on contact shadows, you'll get harder edges like that. This is using the Eevee renderer by default, and will probably be your best bet for pretty much all this, especially if your goal is just to get very quick things put together for reference. We'll add in the floor, put it down here, and now we can start worrying about the output settings. So on the left side of the right panel, you can go to the different options for scene rendering, basically. None of this stuff really needs to be worried about, except for the shadows tab like I illustrated before. But below that is the output properties. And here you can set up things like frame rate, resolution, total frames that are used. We'll go back to the timeline real quick. We'll click on the armature, and we'll see how long this goes on for. This goes on for 59 frames. We'll give it a nice clean 70. And that'll update here as well in the end panel. So you can do that either in the timeline here or in the output settings here. Additionally, you can change the frame rate to whatever you like. I'm using 24 because, you know, just doing frame by frame, it's a pretty common number. Also, you have the output tab, and here you can put in whatever directory you want. I'd recommend you make a folder, and inside that folder, you choose accept, because this is going to export an image sequence. And if you have those just somewhere in the wrong place by accident, it gets really messy. One more option that you have is, I believe it's in the render properties. If you go to film and enable transparent, it will export transparent PNGs. Anything that isn't a mesh won't be rendered. So things like lights, the camera, the background, anything with a checker pattern like that, that's not a material won't be rendered. If we press Control, Alt, and 0, we'll snap the camera to whatever the viewport's looking at. And we can do a quick render, and you can see what I'm talking about here. So all of this checker is going to be transparent when you save it out. That can be very relevant depending on what you're doing. Anyways, one more thing you can do is in the Step tab, you can change this to a different number if you want. And what that basically means is how many steps the animation will take before it renders a frame. So right now it's set to step 1, meaning if it does an animation and it renders that out, it'll move forward 1 keyframe at a time. If you set it to 2 though, you can probably see where this is going. It'll skip every other frame. So only every other frame is going to be rendered. And the same for 3s. Just like that. Hopefully that makes sense. But basically, if you want your 24 FPS animation to look a little bit more hand-drawn, or if you just want fewer frames in general, I recommend doing step of 2. That'll be basically 12 frames every second, but for the duration of 24 frames, if that makes sense. It's the kind of thing I guess you just understand once you get a feel for animation and things like that. Okay, we're going to move over to Clip Studio now with the assumption that you have exported your animation and that you have got it somewhere on hand. I'll hop into here. This folder contains all of my exported frames. I'm going to go ahead and delete all these, and we can together add them to the timeline. This is a basic animation sequence in Clip Studio, specifically Clip Studio Paint EX. If you're using the Pro version, you can only have up to a total of 24 frames. So if you want to animate within those boundaries, you might want to make your Blender animation match that. But if you're using EX, you'll have no problems with a bigger timeline. If you're going to be animating larger projects, I recommend you get EX anyways. It goes on sale pretty often. That being said, what you'll want to do is open up your animation sequence. You can click and drag or shift click all of your images, and then you can drag them directly into your animation folder. It'll import all those, and you want to make sure that they're sequential. I'll just quickly run through. It looks like they might be out of sequence. This goes 31 up to 1. And it looks like that's a problem depending on which ones you click. I'll re-export those just to illustrate how to better do that. So if you click the very bottom, scroll to the top, click the very top, and drag in from there, it should go in order now. So now we should go 1 all the way up to 48. One thing I will do real quick is I'll remove all of the keyframes that I have on my timeline now. I'm going to start from scratch. We can just do delete there. So now we have a totally empty timeline here at the bottom as far as my 3D model stuff goes. Now what we're going to want to do is, again, go to the bottom of the animation folder, go to the top, shift click all of these, and there's a couple ways you can get to it, but I like clicking on the 3 horizontal dots next to the timeline here. Go to Edit Track, Batch Specify Cells. It'll open up this panel here. Enable Specify Name of Existing Animation Cell. Just click that. And depending on if you want to have, actually this might be a required part because you want to have these come out on 2s, depending on if you exported out the step 2 or the step 1 out of Blender from earlier. If you have it on step 1, you can leave this the same. I like to have it on 2 because it's fewer frames for me to draw that way. And then you can just press OK, and that'll export out a sequence every 2 frames. We can zoom in a little bit here and show that a bit better. So here's a frame, there's a frame, there's a frame, etc. So from there, what you can do, say you have an exported sequence at 1080p. My project file is 4K. If you click on the folder that these are all stored in, and then Control T, you can scale all of them up at once. You have to be careful not to do the layer itself because it'll scale that separately. So you want to make sure that you click on specifically the animation folder here at the top. And from there, it's pretty much just a matter of drawing over top of the sequence. I assume that if you're watching this and got this far, you already probably know how to animate within Clip Studio or whatever program you're using. This isn't specific to just Clip Studio. So I won't go into too much detail about how to actually draw over top of this stuff. You should probably have it figured out by then. At any rate, though, that's pretty much the whole thing. I hope that this was relevant. I hope that it was useful. I hope that it was, like, clear enough. I'm not very good at doing directed videos like this with a purpose, but if you made it this far and you're hearing this, I think that means it was probably something you could follow along with. I appreciate you for watching this, and I hope that you can take advantage of this kind of thing. And if you do, I hope that you share it with me. You tag me in it on Twitter or on Discord, wherever you're at. Once again, this project file will be available in the attachments on the Patreon post. I'll include the actual file of the animation, and I'll include the Blender file as well. And you can take a look in there and play with it however you like. Should work for just about any Blender version. I'd say your best bet is to use at least Blender 2.8, but anything beyond that should be fine. And yeah, I'd like to make some more in-depth videos about my actual processes doing stuff. The more I do, I think the better I'll get at actually describing what I'm doing. And I've not been streaming lately, and I probably won't be for a while. So hopefully this will be a good appetizer until I get back to doing that. At any rate, though, if you're watching this, I appreciate it, and good luck to you.